Dr. Rene Olivares, a moral studies historian who's working on a book on the American occupation in the Sulu Sultanate. He was a former professor of Islamic studies at Ateneo and currently teaching moral history and Islam at the Divine Word Theologate in Tagaytay. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for the invitation.
Talking about Bud Dajo, something that came into fore because President Rodrigo Duterte mentioned it a couple of times. Is this Bud Dajo massacre something taught in school?
I went through the regular studies, and even at UP, I never heard Bud Dajo. It's only when I started working on my doctoral dissertation that the Bud Dajo story began to appear and became very interesting, because apparently in 1906 there was even a reaction from the US Congress based on this massacre. So from their perspective, apparently they know something about what happened in Bud Dajo, but sad to say, it has never been discussed in Philippine
any
studies.
of the schools?
In any of the schools.
Then and now?
Yes, until today. It has to do probably with Mindanao studies. Okay? When we talk of Philippine history, we only deal with the stories coming from the north and the Visayas, but rarely we have not heard of the stories coming from Mindanao. So this is one classic story that all Filipinos should know and understand.
That's why you're here. We need to understand this better, analyze it, and look back to go back to 1906 when this actually happened. Actually, this year is the 110th anniversary of the Morrows massacre in Bud Dajo. Let's begin with Bud Dajo. What is Bud Dajo?
Okay, but Bud Dajo is an extinct volcano. Okay, it's not really that high, so it's easy in a sense for the Tausug, the Morrows from Holosulu, to climb in the resistance against the Americans. So that's it. It's a distinct, and like typical rebels, they choose something outside wherein they cannot be easily reached by people that they.
That's their fortress, the Bud Dajo,
That's their fortress,
which is a volcano, and they stayed in the crater. Is that correct?
Near the crater
rather,
area,
yeah. And my understanding also is that Bud Dajo is just about, is it true, 6 to 7 kilometers away from Holosulu?
Not far. Not
so that's
far
that's quite near.
That's right, near.
All right. 1906, a number of Morrows trekked the volcano, this extinct volcano, to defy American rule, is it?
That's right. Technically, it's sovereignty. Okay, so I think the turning point there is the sidula, as they call it. Okay, for the Tausug, sidula symbolizes sovereignty. When you start paying taxes to a foreign group that has occupied Holo, so they don't want that.
So they did not want the cedula.
They don't want to pay the sidula, and in fact, they call it. It's a history of Lupasug. It's a silsila of Lupasug. There is a narration. If you pay tax, when you die, you ride on a pig. So for them, the idea of, it's not sophisticated Islam, but for them, riding on a pig is offensive. It will make you impure. So that in itself, in the consciousness of people, is there is only one sovereign. It's only Allah. So when we pay taxes or sidula to the Americans, we are accepting their sovereignty over our Allah.
Instead of Allah.
Instead of Allah.
So that was the perception of the Morrows then. Having to pay revolutionary taxes to the Americans was almost like a contradiction to what they believed in.
Exactly.
Who, the sovereign, the only sovereign being, spirit, or person for that matter is Allah.
Allah. And it's interesting, during the battle itself, it's documented.
Before we go to the battle,
yes,
let's go chronological. So how many Morrows actually trekked Bud Dajo and somehow create a fortress there?
Yeah, it started, so it's not only a 3-day thing. We can go as far as maybe 10 months or a year, or go as far as 3 years ago, because there are 3 groups of Tausug, or groups that went up, because there were 3 resistances. Okay, like it started with Panglima Hasan of 2003, and there is a there is a Datu Usap, and eventually Datu Pala.
So those 3 are almost like the leaders of these people who went up to Bud Dajo.
Oh, right. So when their leaders, in a sense, they lost their battles against Americans in that area, all the followers wanted to sustain. They understood probably what their datus were telling them. The concept of we cannot be under these people. It will not make us, it will lessen our identity as Muslims. It does not make us good Muslims if we submit to a foreign group. So there is a theological, it's interesting. They're very simple people, but their theology is very clear, that there is only one Allah and we are sovereign under Him.
Did they think that it was a sin to do that as well, to follow the cedula?
Precisely. It's against Islam.
It's against Islam. So they trekked. They decided their three leaders actually died because the three were at the forefront of the resistance of American rule or sovereignty. So the three leaders died, and the followers eventually said, we're going to have to look for a place to live and stay away and build a fortress.
That's right.
Okay. So what happened? They trekked to Bud Dajo.
Well, they trekked to Bud Dajo. But we have to factor in also the role of the Sultan. Okay. Ideally, okay, if the Sultan was a good Sultan, they will submit. But they look at the Sultan as already compromised, being paid or salaried already by the American forces and a few of the datus. So the Sultan and the datus, in fact, they are the ones who instigated, bring these people back to Jolo. Okay, they refuse to submit, so they are unlawful in a sense. So the Sultan also played a role. So it's not just the American running after, but the participation of the Sultan then, Jama'ul ul Kiram II, and some of the datus should be factored in the narrative.
And Doctor, to be clear on that, the Sultan and the datus are the leaders, and they are Filipinos.
Today, we want to use the term that they are Filipinos. Okay, at that time, at the turn of the 20th century, there is no concept of Filipino.
I mean, hindi sila Amerikano.
Okay.
That's what I meant.
Hindi sila Amerikano. Okay.
And then because you were saying that they were compromised, parang the datus and the sultans were siding with the Americans, and this was to the dismay of the Morrows.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because ideally, a good sultan or a good datu would care for the people.
For their people.
But they abandoned the people, and here there are more than 1,000 already at the mount resistant.
So originally, there were about 600 of the Morrows who went to Bud Dajo. Trekked Bud Dajo, lived there, and I understand that they planted corn, or was it potatoes or rice? Yeah. They started to live in that volcano, 600 of them. And then eventually, that ballooned to about 1,000 Morrows?
That's right.
Okay.
It was really a village. And I mean, when you think of a volcano, a extinct volcano, source of water and probably vegetation is rich. So they managed to create a little barangay or a little village up there.
And can you imagine that was in 1906?
1906.
Yeah. Well, let's first listen to this, Doctor. We want to listen to the statement of President Rodrigo Duterte on September 5th. He was in Davao getting ready to go to the ASEAN summit in Laos. He was asked by a journalist what he would tell President Barack Obama if asked about extrajudicial killings in the country. Mr. Obama was also attending the ASEAN summit and was scheduled to meet with Mr. Duterte. And as we know, that meeting with Mr. Obama was canceled.
The Philippines is not a vassal state. We have long ceased to be a colony of the United States. Alam mo, marami dyan mga sa kolumnista, they look upon Obama and the United States as if we are the lapdogs of this country. I do not respond to anybody but to the people of the Republic of the Philippines. Wala pong pakialam sa kanya. Who is it to confront me? As a matter of fact, he has too many, America has one too many to answer for the misdeeds in this country.
America has one too many to answer for the misdeeds of the country, and the example used by the president was the Bud Dajo massacre. Let's go back to that, sir. So they went up the mountain, they ballooned to about 1,000, and then what happened?
Okay. Then within that 3-day period, okay, with the consent of the Sultan, the Americans started to climb. Okay, before they climbed, they started shelling the place. There's just a gap in the narrative. They couldn't really go up because there is a character in the silsila named Adam. He was with a group, and in fact, he was one of the leaders at Bud Dajo, and they were rolling these logs, and the Americans were having a difficult time climbing. apparently, from the story, from the narrative, Adam was bribed. Okay, thanks to Haji Butu, who concocted. I know this guy. He can be bought. Pwedeng bilhin.
Sinabi niya, we can bribe Adam.
We can bribe
para
Adam.
makaakyat yung...
Para makaakyat.
Okay, the
Kasi
Americans.
with the absence of the force from Adam, it was already open for the Americans to go up.
And the force you're talking about, that says Adam, had logs on ropes. Kaya pag umaakyat na yung mga Amerikano, he cuts the ropes and then the logs will roll so the Americans won't be able to trek up the volcano. And then he was bribed. So that allowed the Americans to actually make it up.
Easier. Because there was, okay, that apparently from the narrative, that's the most difficult thing to do. Americans were not probably trained really to track Bud Dajo, and with that thing blocking them, it was more difficult for them to go up. Okay.
So then the battle happened.
Okay.
Were the Morrows armed themselves? Because I understand that the Morrows themselves had guns, rifles, cannons. Is this true?
Paltik, little guns here and there, and much of it's Chris, or the other times they used to call barong, a small bolo. Okay.
There were no cannons.
No cannons.
No such
they
thing.
were so inferior to what the Americans were using. And in fact, they were even shelled earlier before the Americans went up. So it's almost like when you look at it, it was a massacre. They cannot fight against a more superior force.
And then 600 Moros died.
And more, as some historians will claim. It's just 600 could be a conservative estimate, but 600 plus at least died.
And on the side of the Americans?
They're talking here about, from record, it's 100 something, a little. And in fact, we cannot say that they were just Americans because they were accompanied by, we call it the scout, Philippine scout, and people probably from the north and the Visayas who accompanied the Americans to get Bud Dajo. So if we look at, we're probably dislike for people from the north can also be traced back to that experience.
The Bud Dajo massacre. We are taking a closer look at the bloody massacre in Jolo in 1906, known as the Battle of Bud Dajo. There is a measure now in the House that calls for March 6 to be named Bud Dajo Day. And if passed into law, government agencies and local government units will be mandated to hold activities to raise public awareness on what happened that day when some 600 Moros were killed by the Americans. Let's just go back. So 600 men, women, and let me add children died. What was that battle like? Because from what I read, it was as if the women wore men's clothes, fought with their husbands, their children in tow, and then it was as if it was an accomplishment for somebody, at least a Filipino, to die with one American dead beside him or her. Is that true?
If we look at numbers, okay, I want to correct myself. There were only about 26 Americans who died at Bud Dajo. But it has to do with a belief system. In fact, they've recorded women and men shouting, "Fisabil Allah," okay, in the path of God. So I think those who died at Bud Dajo, they knew what they were fighting for. And they are willing. So it's almost not like exclusive to the men. Even women believe in that. We cannot be subservient to any foreign group. So they were there, dressed in men, and they knew they cannot win a battle with just bolo and barong, but they continued on. Okay, so the massacre, in a sense, is very symbolic. If you look at it now historically, that's powerful image for a tausug. They should be proud to be Muslims, in a sense, and if we interpret it from that context. So in the current context, if I was listening to our president, it's a colonial period, okay, and they are not directly subservient. We cannot treat them as criminals, or we cannot just easily correlate it as extrajudicial killing at the same time. We can't. It's a different situation. There's a colony, there's an occupation, okay? But in today's context, we're dealing here with people, citizens, we know them, we live with them. It's kind of very rough. You can discuss it, but it's kind of in a sense, forced.
So you can't compare it. It's apples to oranges.
It's different. It's really different. And in fact, when you look at the Bud Dajo experience, it was not only the Americans, the Datus and the Sultan cooperated with them.
Understandably. Okay.
Yeah.
In line with that, I'd like to bring this in, Dr. Oliveros. Yesterday, Mr. Duterte had yet another strong message to the United States and also to the EU. Here's Ina Andolong.
He has a drug problem to fix, and he's not happy with how the United States responded to it. President Duterte says the U.S. wanted him to focus on rehabilitation of drug suspects, but he says the present national budget does not give him the resources to do that. Instead of helping the Philippines address its widespread problem of illegal drugs, the president says the U.S. opted to criticize his methods. This doesn't sit well with a tough-talking president.
Nawalan ako ng respeto sa Amerika. Nawalan ako ng respeto sa... Instead of helping us, knowing fully well that alam nila because they have a government similar as ours. Instead of helping us, ang unang tumira itong State Department. So, you can go to hell. Mr. Obama, you can go to hell. EU, better choose purgatory.
Instead of calling him out in public, the president says the U.S. should have coursed its concerns through the proper channels like the United Nations. The president discussed plans to adjust the country's foreign policy, one that's less dependent on the U.S. He's eyeing stronger ties with China and Russia, which he says have both agreed to give the Philippines all its military needs. He recently announced that joint military exercises with the U.S. will end soon, and he stresses why.
Paniwala ka dyan sa Amerikano. They will not fight to die for us. Wala tayong nakikap. Tanungin ninyo yung mga military. Ano naman dyan sila? Yung war games. Tanungin mo yan silang military. Sila lang ang natututo dyan using our soldiers. Because yung equipment nila, pati equipment natin, there is no compatibility. Hindi magkasya.
President Duterte says he'd rather bow to the royalties of Brunei and Thailand, but never to the U.S. His recent pronouncements have prompted even his allies to advise him to be more circumspect, but there's no sign of him stopping.
Ito lang ang masabi ko sa inyo. Kaya ako talaga galit. Never man by mouth. Pare-pareho man tayo. I never aspired to be a statesman.
Ina Andolong, CNN Philippines.
And let's go back to more studies, Morrows studies historian, Dr. Rene Olivares. We're talking about this because it's a source of, obviously, a frustration for President Rodrigo Duterte. And the Bud Dajo massacre is not really a very known part of history for all of us, even you yourself, and even the students then and now. So how important do you think is it for us to understand, know, and this be taught, the Bud Dajo massacre?
I have a class of future priests, and one of the stories that I share with them is the Bud Dajo story, because it's important for Filipinos to understand that people down south, the Moro, they have a faith, they have a belief, their religion as Muslims, and for them to act, usually it comes from a belief system. So that would easily resonate with probably ordinary Filipinos. We also believe in God. But in the context when their religion in 1906 was threatened, they were really up there to defend their faith. So for me, as someone from Mindanao, my primary concern, of course, is peace and development. Okay, so for me, it can be an academic thing, but it is also a personal thing. Like, given that this is already a story being narrated all over the place in media, I think it's right, it's just proper for the U.S. to recognize and apologize. Okay? In 1906, I can understand that, or even the U.S. Congress in itself in 1907, when they reacted strongly against Bud Dajo, which ended the career of General Leonard Wood, was already an indicator that even in the U.S., they knew that there was something wrong, the way they were governing the Sulu Sultanate. So that's indicative that there are people Okay, we look at there are certain foreign policies, probably the U.S. foreign policy in the turn of the 20th century, but there are individuals like Leonard Wood, who was very harsh from the start, but ended up becoming a champion of the Moro. When the Moros were disarmed, he was there to protect the Moros from people from the north, the Filipinos from the north.
What you're talking about is after General Wood, who led this massacre, he had to vacate his post because the U.S. Congress was not happy. As a matter of fact, called this massacre a slaughter.
Exactly.
The U.S. Congress called this a slaughter, and so General Wood was taken out of his post, and he returned 13 years later and became
Governor General.
And the champions of the
Moros. So it's interesting that if you look at from Bud Dajo, and after that, Americans, in a sense, historically, are not really bad after all in the Mindanao experience, history. They were, in a sense, defended by good administrators like Leonard Wood. So even amongst the Datus, when there was already a bill wherein people from the north will start governing Mindanao, they asked the Americans to stay.
To come in and help,
And help. And to the point, it's almost like take us as a territory. We would rather be under you than people from the north.
See, that's what people don't seem to, we're not too much educated. We're not aware of that particular part of history. But you were saying again, let me repeat this, that you feel that the Americans should apologize for what happened in Bud Dajo.
Given what at least our president is stating, it's just for the Moros to hear also, recognize it's part of our history. Okay? And apologize, move on, let's continue working, developing. When we think of Mindanao, there is Del Monte, there is Dole, and other U.S. investment. It's not just like we just set all these things aside. I still look towards development really for Mindanao that should extend up to Holosulu area.
Okay, on a last note, you said you are from Mindanao, you are a Tausug. Is the Bud Dajo massacre on a personal level something that you have forgiven, for example, not just the Americans but even the Filipino sultans and datus who formed part of this massacre in 1906?
Yes, I forgive, but I don't forget. That's part of understanding our history. I think if the challenge there, if I have to remind the datus and the sultan, be good datus and sultan and care for your people. Because the Dajo story is really, they were expecting the datus and the sultan to protect them, but they were abandoned. And their religion was like they trusted their datu and their sultan, but they were abandoned by their rulers, in a sense.
Dr. Rene Olivares, sir, thank you so much for helping us understand this and giving us perspective, a better perspective on what happened back in 1906.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.